For 438 days, a single man drifted across the largest ocean on Earth in a tiny open boat, with no engine, no sail, and no compass. He crossed more than 6,000 miles of empty water without charts, without fresh supplies, and without another human voice. His world shrank to a few meters of fiberglass, and whatever he could pull from the sea with his bare hands. The waves took his crewmate, his gear, and almost his mind, but somehow, they did not take his life. This is the true story of José Salvador Alvarenga, the fisherman who vanished off the coast of Mexico in 2012 and was found 14 months later on a remote Pacific atoll in the Marshall Islands. It is a story that sounds like a legend, but that oceanographers, doctors, and investigators have spent years confirming. A story of hunger, storms, madness, and endurance at a scale few humans have ever survived. It began, as such stories often do, with something ordinary. On the morning of November 17, 2012, in the small fishing town of Costa Azul on Mexico's Pacific coast, the harbor was waking up in the great light. The Pacific, there is not the blue of tourist posters. It's a working sea, murky, restless, marked by the comings and goings of small fiberglass boats with outboard motors and scarred hulls. Alvarenga was 35 years old, a Salvadoran by birth, a fisherman by necessity. He'd left El Salvador years earlier, part of the quiet migration of men looking for work anywhere it could be found. In Chiapas, Mexico, he found it on the water, shark fishing, coastal runs, whatever the bosses needed. It was dangerous, hard on the body, and paid little, but for men like him, it was better than nothing. He knew the sea. He knew when the wind was wrong, when the clouds meant trouble. He'd ridden out squalls and once survived 3 days adrift when a previous boat had lost power. That experience had taught him one brutal lesson. The Pacific does not care if you are careful. It only cares that you are small. On that November morning, the sky did not look especially threatening. That job was familiar. Head out in a 7-meter, about to 5 foot fiberglass skiff. F. Cast lines for shark. K. Fill the ice chest with enough cash to make the trip worthwhile. E. And come back by nightfall. He was not supposed to go alone. The captain he usually worked with was unavailable. Instead, the boss paired him with a new helper, a tutuyearold named Ezequiel Córdoba, a young G. inexperienced D. But Alvarenga had reservation. S. The boy was green and the trip would take them far from shore. E. 50 to 100 kilometers T. Where the fish were bigger and the weather less forgiving. G. But there was no choice. E. If he refused. D. Someone else would take the work. They loaded the boat with what they thought they needed. Hundreds of yards of line. Hooks. A small icebox for bait in. Hopefully, for shark meat. A few basic tools. An old VHF radio. And the kind of supplies fishermen on day trips carry when they think they'll be back by evening. Some soda, a few tortillas, a bit of dried food, no emergency rations, no life raft, no satellite beacon. They pushed off. The outboard sputtered to life, and the little boat cut a wide wake away from the beach. On land, people watched them go, then turned back to their own business. It was just another morning in Costa Azul. By midday, they were far from shore, just a white hull rocking on a vast plate of water. They worked the lines, pulled in fish, watched the horizon. Clouds thickened, the wind shifted, a line of darker water moved toward them as squalls built offshore. In small boat fishing, there is always a calculation. Do you run back to port and protect your life but lose the catch and possibly your job? Or do you push your luck, trusting experience and instinct, hoping the storm passes or skirts around you? Alvarenga listened to the radio, checked the sky, and made his choice. They would keep fishing a bit longer, then head in. He called his boss on the VHF, reported their coordinates, mentioned the weather turning. It was a short, ordinary exchange. It would be the last time anyone on land heard his voice. The storm hit faster than he expected. It came in hard, with slanting rain and wind that chopped the swells into a messy, violent sea. The little boat pitched and slammed against the waves. Water began to come over the low sides. The motor strained. They tried to pull in their long lines. It was a mistake. The pressure of the sea on the lines loaded the boat, made her harder to control. In the chaos of rain and spray, something shifted a tangle of gear. A sudden wave, a rush movement, and a massive hook-loaded line slid overboard. With their only real link to their employer, the GPS and key pieces of equipment. Then, with a cough and a shudder, the outboard died. For a moment, there was just the sound of the wind. Then the boat began to turn, broadside to the waves. Alvarenga tried to restart the motor. Nothing. Saltwater and strain had done their work. He checked the fuel line, the primer bulb, every familiar failure point. The engine would not respond. They were now a powerless hull, at the mercy of current and wind. He grabbed the radio. "We've lost our engine," he shouted, giving their last known position. "We're drifting. Send help." On land, the message was heard but faintly, crackling through interference. Then the battery, already low, died. The boat fell silent. No engine, no radio, no way to steer, and the coast, already a low blur on the horizon, was disappearing behind curtains of rain. For the first hours, the situation did not yet look like a nightmare. Fishing boats lose power. They drift. The current might push them along the coast. Maybe someone would spot them before dark. Maybe the bosses would send a search. Alvarenga did what he knew. He organized. He told crewmate to bail water, to secure loose gear, to tie down anything that might be lost in a capsize. He rigged a crude sea anchor to keep the bow into the swell. He watched the coast, looking for a gap in the storm. Night fell. The shore vanished. The sky closed over them like a lid. When dawn came, the land was gone. The current off Mexico's Pacific coast is not gentle and it is not neutral. It runs west, feeding the great gyre that circulates through the North Pacific, a slow river of water and debris. Without an engine, without a sail, without even a paddle, their boat had become a leaf in the river. At first, they expected rescue. The fishery was tight-knit. Boats knew each other. If one failed to come back, the others would look. They watched the horizon from masts, listened for engines. No one came. Back on shore, storms and confusion delayed the alarm. By the time serious search efforts began, the sea had already moved the small fiberglass hull far from any rational search grid. Planes flew patterns over the blue, saw nothing. After 2 days, then 3, authorities began to scale back operations. After 4, they gave up. On the 5th day, the reality reached the men in the drifting boat. No one was coming. Food and water, in those early days, were still present. They had some drinking water, soft drinks, a bit of dry food. They also had bait, small fish, likely sardines, kept in the icebox. It was not appetizing, but it was protein. They ate sparingly, aware that they didn't know how long they would be out. The sun, unfiltered by smog or roof, burned into the open boat. There was no shade, except what they could improvise by stretching a tarp over part of the hull. The sea around them was deceptively calm, a slow heave rather than a storm chop. That calm was not safety, it was emptiness. Days blended, their drinking water ran low. Then it ran out. Without water, survival shrinks to hours, not days. Dehydration shuts down organs, scrambles the mind. On an open boat, under full tropical sun, the process accelerates. The Pacific, salty and inviting, offered what would kill them if they accepted too much. Desperate, they tried tricks that sailors have passed down for generations. They soaked cloth in seawater, sucked the dampness without swallowing more than a few drops. They peed into containers, sipped their own urine, buying time but not health. Then, after days of scorching sky, the first rain came. It started as a faint darkening on the horizon, a line where the sea changed color under approaching showers. When the drops arrived, they did not soak in. They bounced off the warm fiberglass and off the men's skin as they raised their faces to the sky, mouths open. They had no proper catchment system. They improvised. They used bottles, cut off containers, the icebox, even their clothing to collect and funnel the water. Every liter mattered. Every swallow cooled the panic that had been rising in their bodies. Food, too, had to shift from stored to hunted. In the first couple of weeks, they still had bait. They used it to lure larger fish, catching them on hand lines. Dorado, also called Mehimehe, became a crucial ally and adversary. Fast, strong fish that would hit a bait with power and tear off, if not handled quickly. With practice, they could bring them alongside, club them, and drag them aboard. They ate the fish raw, sushi not as a delicacy, but as necessity. Flesh for calories, eyes and spinal fluid for water, liver for vitamins. They ate everything they could swallow because they did not know what the next day would bring. When their bait ran out and their hooks ran low, they adapted again. They watched the sky. Seabirds sometimes rested on the hull, exhausted. Other times they circled, curious. Alvarenga learned to lie still, waiting, then lunge, grabbing a bird by the legs in a snap of motion. Feathers flew, blood spattered the boat. They ate the birds raw, too. The meat was tough, the organs were not. Turtles became another source. Juvenile sea turtles, drawn to floating debris, sometimes passed near the boat, Catching them barehanded was dangerous. A turtle's beak couldn't tear flesh, but when they managed, it was like landing a moving pantry. Meat, fat, blood, bone each turtle harvested could feed them for days. It was not a sustainable or comfortable diet. It was fuel, and it worked at least for one of them. For the young man, Ezequiel Córdoba, this way of living violated more than his stomach. It collided with beliefs and habits. The idea of drinking turtle blood, of gulping raw bird meat, repulsed him. He ate at first, reluctantly. Then, as weeks turned into months in their bodies, thinned under constant sun and salt, he began to refuse. He talked of home, of his mother's cooking, of God. He prayed. He grew quieter. About 4 months into their drift around February of 2013, Córdoba reached a breaking point. Weak, despondent, he stopped eating. When a sudden rain shower came, he drank so much water, so quickly, that his body, already destabilized by hunger, went into shock. Severe diarrhea, vomiting, dehydration compounded. Alvarenga urged him to eat, begged him, offered him pieces of fish, strips of turtle. Córdoba refused. What happened next is something only one man remembers. In his later accounts, Alvarenga describes holding his crewmate as he weakened, listening to his apologies, his request that messages be taken home if either of them survived. There was no medical help to summon, no treatment to offer. There was only a slow decline, then stillness. On that day, in that tiny boat, death acquired a face. It was no longer an abstraction, no longer a threat shouted by waves. It lay at Alvarenga's feet, in the form of a young man who had joined him only weeks before. For 6 days, he kept the body in the boat. Grief on the open ocean is not like grief on land. There is no place to bury, no priest to call. The ritual is simple and brutal. A few words, perhaps a prayer, and then a body goes over the side, into water that accepts it without ceremony. But Alvarenga hesitated. Alone now, he feared more than loneliness. He feared madness. He spoke to the body. He later said, as if his companion could still hear. He argued with himself. Keeping the corpse aboard could invite disease, but throwing it overboard felt like severing his last human connection. After nearly a week, the practical and the spiritual collided. He wrapped the body and consigned it to the sea. The boat lightened. The emptiness did not. He was now utterly alone. No other human voice. No horizon that changed. No harbor to aim for. Just a shifting dome of sky, a rolling floor of water, and a man in a small boat. From this point on, survival was not just physical. It became psychological trench warfare. He developed routines. They were crude, but they anchored the days. Wake with the light. Scan the horizon for ships. Check lines. Look for birds. For turtles. For any sign of life. Repair what he could. Patch cracks in the hull with bits of plastic and rope. Reinforce frame lines. Tend to sores on his own skin. When rain came, he dropped everything. Turned every container into a collector. When it didn't, he rationed water to sips. He tried to keep track of days. At first, he counted carefully, marking time in his head. After Córdoba's death, time began to blur. Weeks and months became abstractions. There was just sun and dart, hunger and brief moments of fullness, storms and lulls. Hallucinations came, as they do when the brain is pushed beyond its design. He saw lights that weren't there, islands that dissolved when he blinked. At one point, he recalls believing he saw land close enough to swim to, only to realize, as he stood to dive in, that it was a mirage of cloud and shadow. He also saw ships, real ones. On more than one occasion, large vessels passed near enough that he could make out their shaped bulk of a cargo ship, the superstructure of a distant trawler. He screamed. He waved. He held up colored objects. He tried to reflect sunlight with bits of metal and plastic. None of them stopped. At the speed and scale of modern shipping, a 7-meter open boat blends into the texture of waves. Radar filters out such noise. Lookouts, if any, rarely stare at empty horizons for long. To the men on those ships, if they looked at all, he was just another white flash in a field of whitecaps. To him, each passing hull was a knife twist, proof that civilization still existed, that rescue was physically possible and yet, somehow, still denied. He did what humans have always done in places where no one could hear them. He talked to himself. He talked to God. Raised Catholic in El Salvador, he prayed familiar prayers, bargaining, apologizing, petitioning. At other times he swore at heaven, feeling abandoned not just by people but by any higher order. He also talked to imaginary companions. Sometimes he pretended Córdoba was still present, sharing thoughts aloud. At other times he pictured his parents, his daughter, people back home sitting at kitchen tables. living lives that did not include him. These conversations were not signs of collapse so much as tools, ways to keep language alive, ways to stay a person rather than a body going through motions. The boat itself evolved. Barnacles and algae colonized the hull, turning it into a moving reef. Small fish began to trail it, kicking at the growth. Larger predators circled. Sharks accompanied him at times, silhouettes sliding beneath the boat, reminders of where his own body would go if he fell in and could not climb back. He learned the habits of the animals that visited his artificial island. Birds came in patterns. Some rested on the canopy he'd rigged. He reached for them quietly, practiced movements honed by months. He developed what he called a bird trap, using his own body as lure, lying still until they ventured too close, for a few more days. Storms punctuated the monotony. Some were small, brief bursts of wind and rain that gave him water and threatened to smash his gear. Others were full Pacific squalls, with swells that lifted the boat like a toy and dropped it into troughs that fell bottomless. In those storms, he did what he had done in his earlier life as a fisherman. He pointed the bow into the worst of it, rode it out, trusted in the hull. But now, there was no harbor to run for after, only more water. At some point, he crossed an invisible boundary. The water cooled slightly, the patterns of birds changed. Floating debris shifted from Mexican to more anonymous international trash bottles. Fishing floats, the global flotsam that rides currents for years. He had drifted out of coastal waters into the vast central gyre of the North Pacific, then into the equatorial currents that flow westward toward distant archipelagos. He could not know the names of the places he was passing. He didn't have a map of the Pacific in his head, only the knowledge that land lay somewhere to the west, thousands of kilometers away. But his boat, and the ocean beneath it, knew the pattern. They were following it whether he understood or not. Seasonal changes passed over him. He noticed them only as variations in storm frequency, in the type of fish he caught, in the angle of the sun. Somewhere, Christmas came and went. New Year's fireworks crackled above cities thousands of kilometers away. He saw none of it. His holidays were marked by rain showers in the rare days when he managed to eat until he felt something like fullness. His body transformed. Fat reserves, which had been substantial when he left towards a stocky man, melted away. His cheeks hollowed, his muscles, constantly used to balance, to pull in lines, to butcher catches, did not atrophy the way they might have if he'd simply lain still. But he was lean, weather-burned, scarred by the sun. His skin peeled, cracked, burned, then darkened. Salt sores opened, refused to heal easily in the constant damp. His hair grew long, bleached by sun and wind. His fingernails thickened. His hands became claws designed for gripping wet, slippery life. Sometimes, as he sat in the bottom of the boat, watching the sea move around him in all directions, a thought came that frightened him more than hunger. What if this was it? Not just for a few more weeks, but forever. A life not measured in years on land, but in days afloat, until someday the balance tipped and it simply slipped away. And then, after all the storms and all the floating days, after more than a year of drift, the pattern changed again. On the morning of January 30th, 2014, the sea around his boat looked, at first, much like any other. Moving, indifferent. He had long since stopped expecting miracles. If he saw anything on the horizon, he assumed it would vanish. But this time, what appeared ahead did not vanish. It gained detail. A dark, low line, not a ship-round shape, not a cloud to solid land. He thought at first that his mind was playing with him. He blinked, shook himself, looked again. The line grew into a smudge, then into a band of green and white palm trees, surf breaking on a reef. He had, by chance and current, been pushed toward one of the southernmost atolls of the Marshall Islands, Ebon Atoll, a ring of coral and sand in the middle of the Pacific, home to a few hundred people. As he approached, the waves changed character. The gentler open ocean swell became a pounding surf on coral. His little boat, not designed for landings, bucked and slewed. He was exhausted, dehydrated, weak, but adrenaline surged. He had not come this far to be smashed to pieces within sight of shore. Timing the waves, he let the boat be picked up and carried toward a gap in the reef. The hull scraped coral. Pain flared as he was thrown against the sides. Then, with a final shove, the water drove him up onto sand. He tumbled out, onto a beach that was not moving, not floating, not trying to drown him. The sand was hot. It felt unreal. A young woman from the island, walking along the shore, saw something she did not expect, a small battered boat. An almost naked man with long hair and beard, skin burned dark, standing on wobbly legs and crying. He tried greeting her in Spanish. She did not understand. She ran to get help. Within minutes, villagers gathered. They approached cautiously, wary of castaways and of potential danger. The man before them looked less like a tourist than a ghost. He gestured weakly, repeating the same words. "Help, I am alone. I am from Mexico." They took him to the local mayor. He was given water, food in small amounts for fear of shocking his starved system. At the mayor's house, he cried again, this time as much from confusion as relief. He had jumped from a timeline of his own into one that had continued without him. News moved faster than the currents that had carried him. Within hours, word of a mysterious castaway on Ebon Atoll reached Mayuro, the capital. From there, it spread to the world. Doctors examined him. He weighed far less than when he had left Mexico, but he was not the skeletal figure some imagined. Years of physical work and months of continued exertion had preserved muscle that bedbound starvation victims lose more quickly. His body bore the marks of sun damage, of malnutrition, of constant exposure. Authorities checked his story. They looked up missing person reports. They found records of a 2-man fishing crew that had left Costa Azul in November 2012 and never returned. They matched his name. His boss. His boat type. Oceanographers modeled the drift of a small boat from his last known area of operation. The computer simulations traced paths westward, into the heart of the Pacific, looping and meandering, then eventually bending north toward the Marshall Islands. The likely journey length in terms of time and distance matched his account closely. Some people, reading the headlines, "Fisherman survives 13 months adrift," reacted with disbelief. It sounded impossible, like the kind of tale sailors told in port after too many drinks. But as more details came out, as independent scientists and survival experts weighed in, the consensus emerged. Not only was it possible, it was, given the currents and the man's background, plausible. He was, in brutal terms, uniquely qualified to survive a nightmare. He understood the sea, could read its moods, and knew how to extract food from it with improvised means. He had enough initial body mass to endure early losses. He had no chronic conditions that would have killed him quickly. And perhaps most importantly, he had something to go back to, a family. A daughter that kept him from giving in when everything his senses told him said it would be easier to stop. After days on Ebon, he was flown to Mayuro, then, eventually, returned to his homeland, El Salvador, and to Mexico for interviews. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust in his face. For a man who had spent 14 months talking mostly to himself and to God, the sudden press of attention was disorienting. He told his story again and again, of Córdoba, the young man who had died for months in, of rainwater caught in bottles, of raw fish and birds and turtle blood, of hallucinations and prayers, of the decision, made day after day, to do the next small thing, fix a line, bait a hook, raise a hand toward a passing cloud. Not everyone accepted his version of events at first. The family of his dead crewmate, grieving and angry, accused him of not doing enough, even insinuated cannibalism. Later, as investigations proceeded, lawsuits fizzled. There was no evidence beyond speculation, and the man who could have contradicted him lay somewhere on the Pacific floor. Others questioned details. Could a man really survive that long on such a diet? Doctors pointed out that traditional coastal peoples had done similar things for centuries, though not usually for so long without land. Could a boat without sail or engine really drift that far? Ocean current studies said yes. In time, his story was turned into a book, 438 Days, written with journalist Jonathan Franklin, drawing on interviews, medical reports, and scientific modeling. It painted a picture not of a superhero, but of a flawed, sometimes desperate man who, when stripped of nearly everything, clung to the few tools he had: knowledge of the sea, stubbornness, and the remembered faces of people he loved. In a global culture saturated with adventure narratives, it's easy to treat such a story as just another extreme feat, another survival against the odds, to marvel at and then forget. But look closer, and something else emerges. This was not the saga of a sponsored explorer, backed by teams and technology. It was the ordeal of a migrant laborer in a precarious industry, working on a boat without basic safety gear, because margins were thin and regulations lax. His survival highlights both the raw resilience of a single human and the systemic risks quietly borne by countless others in similar trades, most of whom do not make headlines when they vanish. It also forces us to confront what survival really means over the long term. Not a dramatic burst of effort in a single crisis, but a long, grinding sequence of small choices under terrible conditions. Choosing to eat something you never would have considered food. Choosing to get up one more time to chase a bird. Choosing to repair a line when you'd rather sink into apathy. For 438 days, José Salvador Alvarenga made those choices. Many were messy, some were desperate. Together, they added up to life. He drifted across an ocean in a boat barely longer than a pickup truck. Without a sail, without a motor, without a map, the currents of the Pacific took him from the coast of Mexico to a dot of land thousands of kilometers away, a place he had never heard of. The sea that nearly killed him, finally, returned him to sand. His story is not comfortable. It raises questions about the value placed on lives at the margins, about the thin line between plausible and impossible, about what any of us might do when all the ordinary structures of life fall away and we are left alone with water, sky, hunger, and time. But it also stands as one of the most extraordinary records of human endurance ever documented, not in a world of cameras and support crews, but in a place without witnesses, where the only record for months was the continuation of a single heartbeat in a small, drifting boat. This account is based on survivor interviews, medical reports, and scientific drift analysis, including Jonathan Franklin's book, 438 Days and Oceanographic Studies, that modeled the path of a powerless skiff across the Pacific. If this story moved you, or made you rethink what a human being can survive, please take a moment to like the video. It really helps more people find these stories. And if you want more true stories of survival, endurance, and the thin line between life and death, make sure to subscribe to the channel. There are many more journeys like this waiting to be told.